My name is Joe Forte. I work for Virginia Tech Publishing in the university libraries at Virginia Tech. I'm talking today with Thomas A. Guglielmo from George Washington University. Dr. Guglielmo is an associate professor of American Studies at George Washington, and he sits on the advisory board for the American Soldier Project. Dr. Guglielmo has a specialization in study of civil rights and race in the military. And during World War II, he has a forthcoming book on the topic. So we asked him to comment today on some of the transcriptions of the responses by soldiers in the American Soldier Project that deal with issues of race in American society and in the military during World War II. Dr. Guglielmo, thanks so much for joining us. How did you find some of the transcriptions you came into contact with in the context of your study and the scholarship more broadly on race during this period?
Well, thanks so much for having me. So yeah, these were fantastic interview segments and very much in line with a lot of what I know about this period and a lot of what scholarship has taught us about this period. So I would say one of the most important things that you realize immediately is the way in which soldiers, white and black soldiers, are um, convinced they're struggling in fighting in two wars during World War II. There's the well-known one between the Axis and the Allies on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's this race war, or civil war, that they reference directly in a lot of these comments. Um, they see themselves fighting both of these wars at the same time, and they see themselves fighting this war after the one between the Axis and the Allies ends. So they see this race war as continuing well into the post-war years. So that's a really kind of central motif running through all of these comments. But then there are kind of the particulars of that race war that I think are really also especially interesting. Um, so, for example, on the African American side, you just see the amount of disillusionment and rage with the hypocrisy that was everywhere on display during the war years, right? So on the one hand, you have the US government proclaiming itself to be the defender of the four freedoms all around the world. On the other hand, they are, the US government that is centrally involved in humiliating African American soldiers, segregating them, discriminating against them on a daily basis, in and out of the military. And you see so many of these black soldiers commenting on that and enraged by that. I mean, it's actually interesting. You get a nice range of responses from African American soldiers. You're talking about 1 million people during World War II. 1 million African Americans served in the war, um, hundreds of thousands in the army. And so, of course, you're going to get a lot of diversity, and you see that diversity in these responses. Some are just somewhat hopeful. They're saying, at the end of this war, I've learned about the value of life, and I hope that my fellow white Americans will also see that racism is ridiculous and unjust and at odds with our war aims. And so I hold out hope that this country at long last will live up to its ideals. On the other hand, there are people who are saying, we've been through this before. World War I was a war to make the world safe for democracy, and there were race riots everywhere afterwards, and nothing at all changed with regard to Jim Crow, with regard to their day-to-day lives in the South and in the North. And so there are people who are just completely cynical and jaded and feel like there's never, ever going to be any change. But what you also see is this growing determination on the part of Black soldiers to say, you know what, yes, times have not changed in the past, but we will insist, we will demand, we will require that this time will be different, right? And so you see a number of soldiers speaking about this newfound commitment. And of course, it had been around for decades and decades, centuries, really, in one form or another, obviously. But when African Americans are risking their lives for the United States, are having to do so under the most trying and discriminatory conditions, and all the while are being told that they're doing this to defend democracy. Um, these are folks who are politicized in new and profound ways, and they are determined, as you see them suggesting in a lot of these interviews, they're determined to fight for their equality, to fight for their liberation, to fight for their full freedoms and citizenship rights during the war and after the war. On the other hand, and this is what makes this a race war, is on the one hand, you have African American soldiers newly emboldened, newly politicized, newly determined um, to fight for their equality. On the other hand, you have white soldiers who are fighting for the exact opposite. They're fighting for a white supremacist status quo, and they say as much. And they're very, some of these folks, so we've only got a few interviews here, but they say very explicitly, this is, I believe in segregation, I believe in white supremacy, and I want to keep those things during this war and well after this war. And some of these white soldiers fully recognize the ways in which the World War II years are a threat to them and their way of life. That America says it's fighting for four freedoms, and if you think about it for a second or two, with any level of um, kind of critical attention, you have to recognize that there are large swaths of the United States and certainly the Jim Crow South, which are not living up to those ideals. And whites understand that they are newly under threat and that their systematic racism is newly controversial and perhaps unstable in some kind of way. And threatened in a serious way. And so what you have here coming out of the war are two very um, uh, two kind of armies in a way. Really, you've got kind of black folks newly determined to fight for their equality and their full citizenship rights. And then you have some white folks who are determined to deny them those rights and to maintain white supremacy at all costs. And so you've got these kind of competing forces. Of course, white folks have a lot more on their side. They've got the US government, they've got Congress, they've got the White House. Things are beginning to change. They've got the military establishment, all kind of more or less on their side. Um, but but things could change. Things could change. Things do change to some extent during the war, in and out of the military. And that's where some of the hopefulness comes too. Again, there's some African Americans who are convinced nothing's going to change. But then there's some African Americans who are holding out hope. And part of that hope is coming from a US government that's finally, really for the first time since Reconstruction, is starting to say, you know what, maybe there is kind of a disconnect between our wartime rhetoric and our policies with regard to African Americans, among other folks of color. I'd say one other quick thing about the white respondents. What's not represented here, but I have to believe is represented somewhere in the study, are white soldiers who come out of the military not more committed than ever before to white supremacy, but more committed than ever before to dismantling white supremacy. That they too see the hypocrisies. They too see the kind of impossible disconnects between our rhetoric and our reality. And they, in certain cases, of course, the Jim Crow military makes this very difficult, but in certain cases, certain rare instances, black and white soldiers really connect during the war. They, again, despite the fact that so many units, virtually all units, were segregated, in certain instances, black and white soldiers worked together. And in certain instances, they discovered that, that these differences that had been taught to them, particularly white folks that had been taught to them for decades and decades, were completely superficial, and that America had to be a more equal place after the war. So you have a segment of white soldiers coming back who are saying, you know what, I gave my life for the four freedoms, and I want to make sure that those things are real in the United States as well. Now, they were a minority, sadly, but they were present and their numbers were growing.
Yeah, I see all that you're referencing in these excerpts, and one of the overarching themes of what you're pointing out is the complexity. That the complexity that exists in the diversity of the responses, and the sort of paradox that while little has changed, what has changed is that the hypocrisy is so much more front and center in a way that the expressions of these soldiers bears out the fact that it can no longer be ignored, or they're increasingly American society and these soldiers specifically are increasingly less able to ignore it.
Hmm.
And I think that both the diversity and that complexity also is enhanced in our experience in engaging these sources by the personal nature of these responses. Could you say a little bit about the sort of value of uh, reaching into the army in this way, very personally and very specifically, to get responses from soldiers on this very individual and granular level?
Sure. Yeah, so the beautiful thing about these responses is that they offer us this kind of this intimate look at black and white soldiers' most personal views. Um, we know about Eisenhower, we know about Marshall, we know about Patton, we know about Roosevelt in this time, right? We even know about some particular units at particular times. They've received a lot of attention in pop culture and in scholarship as well. But it's extraordinarily difficult to know how ordinary people, black and white soldiers during the war, not in interviews 30, 40, 50, 60 years later when their views have perhaps changed with the times. No, these are their kind of intimate reflections on their views during World War II. And these are extraordinarily rare and therefore unbelievably valuable.
Yeah. So, what about the sort of the nature of this project, the American Soldier Project, the crowdsourcing of processing these primary sources? Um, what's the value of that in your estimation against the backdrop of your scholarship on race?
So World War II is as popular a topic in US history as there is. And there are millions and millions of books and articles out there, and popular movies, and a memorial on the mall, and big museum exhibits. And yet, there's very little opportunity to kind of peer into the soul of World War II soldiers. And that's what these interviews do. And they've been around for a while, but they haven't been easily accessible. You've had to go to the National Archives, take a day and go to the National Archives and dig up these microfilm reels and go through them. But what the beauty of the American Soldier Project is that they are making them available to everyone. Anyone with a computer and an internet connection can now have access to these really personal reflections, wartime personal reflections of soldiers during the war. And again, it offers this unparalleled look at the lives of the ordinary GI.
Well, Dr. Guglielmo, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I thank you for your time this morning. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I guess the one thing I would simply say is a limitation in the survey itself, which I think I think it'll be helpful. I'll say this to you quick first, and then you can decide whether you think this is important. I mean, one of the things that my book looks at is we know a lot about um, black-white race relations in the military. We don't really know about other groups. We don't really know as much about Native Americans. We don't know as much about Mexican Americans or Chinese Americans or Puerto Ricans. And their experiences were racism shaped their lives too in the military in ways that we're just beginning to recognize. Um, Unfortunately, the American soldier surveys from the war did not these soldiers who were neither white nor black um, were very small in number, generally speaking. With the exception of Mexican Americans, they were approximately 400,000, but they were routinely defined as white and placed in white units. But in any case, that's a piece of the kind of race and World War II story that we don't really know about as much about. And unfortunately, these surveys don't help us as much, right? So whereas they are, as I said, this unparalleled access into the views of black and white soldiers, we unfortunately, we don't know as much about other soldiers who were defined as neither white nor black.
But for scholars like yourself who bring a critical eye to the source material, they do identify these gaps and therefore suggest directions for further research.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think the interviews, I think they they can identify the gaps, or they can kind of obscure them by suggesting,
Mm.
well, these are the stories, and there really aren't other stories, these surveys come from Samuel Stouffer, who wrote this, monumental 4-volume study about the American soldiers' experiences during the war, called "The American Soldier." And to his credit, he's got a huge chapter on African American soldiers, and he's drawing on these very comments that we're talking about. In addition to all kinds of quantitative surveys, but nowhere in there is there anything about any of these other groups. And so there's nothing so it's unfortunate, and people can kind of come away thinking, oh, well, I guess there weren't any other soldiers. There were just black and white soldiers.
Mm.
There's a way in which it can obscure these other stories, which I think are really interesting and important too. And in some ways shape the story we're talking about, and especially the Japanese American story. Because of their presumed connection to the Japanese enemy. They faced all kinds of racist restrictions as well, but they were different than the ones African Americans faced. Their experiences were very different, even if there was overlap. And so, anyway, that's part of what my book is about.
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Guglielmo, for speaking with us. Thomas A. Guglielmo from George Washington University, Associate Professor of American Studies there, and a member of the advisory board for the American Soldier Project.